Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How are you all? I hope you're all doing amazing, and I hope you're excited for today's news. We're going to be covering some super interesting topics that happened in the recent times. First, we have what's all the fuss about with Facebook and Google and Australia. Next, we discuss another government strategy, which is Japan introducing a new minister called the Minister of Loneliness, and what's that all about? Then we move on to some of the initiatives that are happening in the climate change and that front to create a sustainable future. And we also discuss the recent IPO with Bumble and the whereabouts and who is the Bumble CEO, Mrs. Whitney Wolf Herd. So a lot of that coming in. We'll roll the intro, but while you do that, while you're waiting through the intro, you can help us, go up in the ranking by clicking on the like, subscribe, and clicking on the notification button.
Follow your passion might be a perfect question to ask and might have a perfect answer when interpreted right.
Let's start tracking which stocks can actually go up and go down, or which stocks have an advantage with the vaccine coming out.
Why it would have been more expensive to fake a moon landing back in those days. It's quite an interesting video to watch.
The economic activity created from the App Store alone is worth $500 billion.
So let's move on to the next question.
Man, it was too easy.
Too easy, no? Why didn't you answer? Cool, guys. Did you click on the like? I hope you did. Call your friends, get them for the news. It's just 30 to 45 minutes and you're going to learn a lot of cool things. For now, I'll keep this on the side. Cool. So let's get started. Martin, let's have the slide on top. What's the first news about? Okay. What does a search engine do? So recently, Facebook decided to ban the news listings. So it stopped showing news links on their site. You can see on the bottom right a notification that shows that in response to the Australian government's legislation, Facebook is restricting the posting of news links and all posts from news pages in Australia. Let me give you a little bit of context on what exactly is happening. So Google, Facebook, where did they all start off with? For example, where did Google start off with? Google was initially just a simple, landing page with a search engine, with a search bar. But today, Google's identity is much beyond that, right? Can we call Google just a simple search engine? In fact, what about Facebook? Facebook started off as, I remember we discussed Face Smash and all of that. It started off like a simple directory of people's profiles where they could post pictures and, share some information, contact details, etc. But today it's much more than that. In fact, one of the things that I've noticed, or even you probably would agree, is that these social media platforms or, search engines, they're used much more than what they are. And one of the most common reasons or the common use cases of these platforms is news. Yes, we are discussing news. Think of it, YouTube, or what are we doing? Through the social media, through internet, we are we are exposing and publishing news and making it accessible and available to such a huge audience. Our case is slightly different from what this is. So I'll give you a little bit more context on what exactly happened. So let's start with the story. What happened is, now there are a lot of, publishing agencies within Australia, news media platforms, the traditional news media platforms. Now what they did is they started to notice that their revenue was dipping, So when people started to use social media platforms and Google, etc., the traditional news media agencies started to see a dip in their revenue. So then what they did is they went to the government and they're like, bro, government, if this continues, we're gonna lose our source of income. Who's gonna feed our mouths? So then the government was like, but Google and Facebook, they're just search engines or they're just social media platforms. You guys are still doing the news. But then the news media platform said, no, that's not the case. What's the difference between a platform or an app like Flipboard or any other news aggregator and a platform like Google and Facebook, where a lot of the audience is actually heavily, watching the news and getting exposed to the news from there. Now, the government cannot push the news publishers away and be like, hey, this is not the case, because, that's not exactly what Facebook and Google are doing, because news or the traditional news media agencies are extremely important for the government. They're important for administering, what the government policies are, not administering, but at least reaching out. Media, the word media, they're a medium for the government to give the information or, share and publicize the information. It's important in politics and a lot of these things. So now the government cannot say no to these publishing agencies. So what they did is they sent out this inquiry. It was this Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. They sent out an inquiry to check if these big tech companies are actually such huge monopolies and if there's some truth to the concerns of the media agencies. And what they realized is, yes, there is. These big tech companies are in fact, monopolizing the entire field. And because of this, the big tech companies are gaining so much in revenue, whereas that revenue is dipping from the traditional news agencies. So they went to first Google and they told, hey, you will need to, pay these publishing agencies when you're showing these links. Can you show the next slide? I think we have a... Right. So what I'm trying to say is, for example, I did like a simple Google search, right? Which I put out a Google search for the news. And what the agency or the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, says is that when you're putting these links also, you need to pay the publishers of these links too. Now, the Google team, a representative of the Google team in Australia, she put out a video saying, see, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how a search engine works. What she says is, for example, what we are doing is we are just giving them directions to what it is. For example, imagine you have, you're trying to go to a restaurant in a new place. Okay, you walk in the street, you meet this person, and you're like, hey, I want to go to the nearest Pizza Hut. Now that person stands there and he's like, okay, there's a Pizza Hut. If you take a right, then you take a straight, then you go left, and that is where you'll find your Pizza Hut. So Google is like, if such a case happens and you go and actually dine out at the Pizza Hut restaurant, would you be charging the person who gave you directions to the Pizza Hut? Right? So Google says that this is what we are doing. We are simply giving directions and links, and we are not actually hosting the content. But the news agency says that's not the case, right? You have to pay if you are using the content, because content is being used by the customers or the users of your platform. So there was a lot of back and forth. And finally, Google said, okay, we are willing to pay. So Google has agreed to pay this huge amount to Rupert Murdoch's, the News Corp within Australia. And so Rupert Murdoch, they said, okay, we'll come up with this subscription model. If you look at the top right, the mobile, the screenshot, that is of the Google showcase, the Google News showcase. Again, these are this initiatives that they're rolling out to find an agreement. But they're not happy with it. And but Facebook, on the other hand, has gone outright and said, we are not going to tolerate this. Right? We don't care what's happening. We are not going to tolerate it. And they decided, what we'll do is, if you don't want our news, we are not going to pay for it. We're going to ban the news from your channels. We're not going to show the news. But a lot of the consumers started to get affected. The people, the users of Facebook, etc., they started to get affected. Especially one of the situations that happened was emergency news, emergency news and etc. That started to be banned, and that wasn't showed on these platforms. When the situation became so drastic, what Facebook did is they apologized for it. They said that was a mistake, but they're still not willing to, go back. And the Australian government is also not willing to go back. The reason why Facebook is so adamant on the same is because if, this situation starts with Australia, what's stopping, say, a country like Canada or the UK from doing the same thing? And then Facebook's revenue is going to drop. And it's a whole revisioning of the entire, the model, the business model, and the identity of these platforms as search engines or much more, or social media platforms or much more than that. So it's exciting to see what's actually going to happen. We're actually going to see, how these big tech companies are redefining themselves. So yeah, that is the first news. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, what's that? Okay, that's Facebook dating. I don't know if you guys know, there's a platform called Facebook Dating too. But I think I get the transition where we're going with the next news. Next slide. Okay, the first, the best, and the different. We're all, probably aware of these dating platforms that are, widely there. I think it all started with Tinder, if I'm not right, if I'm not wrong. Tinder, then there's one particular dating platform which has come into recent interest, and that is Bumble. Next slide. Okay, so Bumble recently launched its IPO, and on the first day after the debut of the IPO, it was subscribed. I think it shot up by 64%, and I think they started getting the valuation went up to 2.15 billion, making the CEO, Mrs. Whitney Wolfe Herd, one of the youngest billionaires. And at the age of 31, she became the youngest woman billionaire of a large company. I think there was also someone called Emma Sinclair, but she became the first, woman CEO billionaire of a large company. And it's really exciting, her story. Let me give you some context. Okay, it's very close to Valentine's Day, so that's why on the 14th, I think it's 4 days before. So a lot of cool things happen, and I think the entire history is pretty much swiped right on Whitney. And let me give you some context of who Whitney is and where she came from. So Whitney was initially the VP marketing of Tinder, and she was instrumental. She was an early executive, a senior executive of the early Tinder team. In fact, there's some saying that the entire logo of Tinder, the fire, and the naming of Tinder, fire coming out, all of that was Whitney's idea. So she played an important role in the early stages of Tinder. Then Tinder blew up, but Whitney decided to leave. She left because of some, differences and some quarrels, etc., with other executives within the company. She left the company and she decided, okay, I'm going to start something on my own. And that was around the same time that someone else called Andrei Andreev, who was also instrumental who was working on another platform, a dating platform called Badoo. Now, Badoo is one of the most widely spread dating platforms out there. So Andrei Andreev and Whitney Wolfe, they came together and they're like, hey, let's work on something. Let's start to improve what's there. Interestingly, what Whitney did is she actually filed a sexual harassment case against Tinder. She said that there was some issue there, and she got compensated, I think around 1 million and a little bit in stock, to settle the whole case. So, and that was related to the Me Too movement, etc. And then she decided, hey, maybe I can create a platform which is more woman focused. So that's when the whole idea of Bumble came in, which is woman centered or, woman friendly. And Bumble's taken off. As you know, now it's gone with its IPO. And Bumble's not just limited to as a dating platform. It's, try to do a little bit more. So all the funding that they're getting through this IPO, what they want to do is, give off a little bit of the debt, clear the debt that it's gained. And secondly, it also wants to start with new acquisitions. So I'm pretty sure, Bumble has plans on expanding. You saw earlier on that slide that Facebook wants to probably enter into the dating field. In the similar sense, Bumble also wants to, expand and maybe start to go into the social media platform. So there's something called Bumble BFF and Bumble Biz. So Bumble BFF is basically not just dating if you want to find your best friend. And Bumble Biz is trying to, mimic what LinkedIn and Facebook are doing, which is, give people an opportunity to, grow their careers, etc. So you should all check that out. So it's super cool and super exciting to see a revolution in the making and something really important for all the female founders and CEOs and entrepreneurs out there. So super excited. Let's go on to the next news. Oh, okay, this one. Okay, so on the one side, we learned about how, a platform like Bumble is helping people find their love, match, date, chat, etc. But in one side of the world, which is Japan, people are seeing increasing rates of suicide, and they're attributing it to their loneliness, right? And there's this there's this term in Japanese which is called kodokushi, which pretty much translates to solitary death. So earlier on, there was this earthquake that happened, I think in 1995-ish, was called the Great Hanshin earthquake or the Kobe earthquake. And during that time, a lot of people started to, die. And their deaths were different in that, so during the earthquake, they were all told, hey, go to your rooms, don't, get out, things like that, stay safe, stay isolated. And then they would just pass away. So the Japanese population is actually a very senior population. It's a very old population. And after their old age, a lot of these people started to die. And when this happened, it started to come, they came up with this term, it's called solitary death or kodokushi. And a very recent phenomenon, which is the pandemic, has also triggered a very similar thing. Let's go to the next slide. Right. And how Japan has decided to overcome this, or the Prime Minister has decided to overcome this, is by creating this role of Minister of Loneliness. Okay, so the Japanese Minister of Loneliness, for now, it does not really have a JD or a job description as such, or they don't know the exact agenda of it. It's actually replicated this model from another country, and that's the UK. Let's go to the next slide. Do we have anything? Okay, no. You can go to the previous one. Right. So Japan has tried to replicate the model of UK, and UK in the year 2018, it's also very similar to Japan, which has a very senior population, and they started to give a lot of importance in the idea of curbing loneliness and doing something better for the senior citizens. There was a whole mission called the Joe Cox mission, where they ran some surveys, and it became a very important initiative of the government to help curb loneliness. So yes, there's an entire Minister of Loneliness. Now we can go to the next slide. So what I started to do, and we all know how coronavirus has affected us the entire past year. The effects are still there. We're seeing a lot of new strains coming up, a lot of new stories on what the pandemic has to, offer for us and things like that. But one other thing that I started to realize is that there's something called the Great Attention Deficit. So there was recent news where there was a prominent personality who forgot to change his filter on the Zoom meeting, and a cat came in, etc. Now that's one side of Zoom meetings, etc. But there's another Zoom meeting that's important to a lot of you who are watching. So a lot of you are in your schools and colleges, etc. And during these schools and colleges, our entire online education system has changed. And a lot of students are finding it very difficult to curb with it. And I'm not talking about, bad teaching or, classes being boring, etc. But the idea of distractions. You see, when you're sitting at home and you're working on your laptop or your computer and, engaging with these online classes, what happens is the chance of you getting distracted is very high. See, for example, if, you're working on your laptop and on the kitchen, you have your mom or the maid or someone who's cooking something, and so your attention goes there. Whereas maybe your baby sister or your baby brother is running and just playing in the house. Because what's happened is the institutions have changed, right? What was school, which was a separate institution on itself, has combined with your house. And the roles have also changed. Now your parents are no longer just parents. They're also taking up the roles of teachers, right? Maybe not in terms of instruction or tutoring, but they are the ones who, make sure you're actually sitting in class. For me, for example, I remember when I was going to school, I was a very naughty kid, and I wouldn't tell my parents what happens in school. My teachers were the ones who used to see what I was doing, and they were the ones who would tolerate me there. But my parents used to always think that I'm a goody two-shoes. I'm a really good guy. But now for you guys, it's a lot more difficult because your parent is not just your parent, but he or she is also your teacher. And students are finding this very difficult, with all of these distractions. They are starting to get depressed, and a lot of new cases have come in saying that their grades are dropping significantly. Some students are saying they're getting suicidal thoughts, they're getting anxiety. So to curb this, what parents are doing, especially abroad, is they're sending their students to get diagnosed to see if there's something beyond the, if it's not just, casual distractions that everyone's facing, but if there's something serious. And they start to realize there is, a lot of these students are actually, the whole pandemic has triggered, or it's pushed the edge and made it widespread, the whole ADHD diagnosis. Why am I saying this? If you are a student who finds it difficult in your college and school, and if you were a straight A student and now you're seeing, significant drop in your grade and you're finding it very difficult, seek diagnosis, seek medical help, see if there is something beyond just what people say, paying attention and sitting in your seat. Okay, let's go to the final news. Vegetable meat, cars that fly, and bottles made of paper. What's all this? Okay, so I think the last news that we have to cover is the idea of a sustainable future and some of the activities that are happening in the climate change front. So Bill Gates, the very famous Bill Gates, once the world's richest man, the founder of Microsoft, he recently created a book. He wrote a book called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And he's been, through the Gates notes and all of these, he's been pushing this idea that, okay, coronavirus is one thing, but now we also have the climate change that we need to start working towards. And he started telling in this book that one of the most common reasons for climate change and all of this is meat, and meat from cows, the red meat from cows, beef, etc. Grazing cattle, and then we consuming this cattle or the beef, etc. It causes a lot of methane and environment pollution. So he said, let's start switching from the traditional forms of meat to synthetic forms of meat. Kind of scary. So we're going to redefine that, right? Meat is no longer actually going to be meat, not from cows, but maybe plant-based. And he says that all the rich countries should switch 100% to synthetic meat. Synthetic meat also comes in a different form. So there's this team called the Science Focus, and they said, you can start creating meat with the help of stem cells. So you basically take one cell and then you propagate it, you culture it, and you start, propagating that into create actual, lines of meat in the form of, spindle. So it'll replicate the entire model, like they will look like muscles, etc. So we don't know. Would you be willing to have, your dish served from a petri dish? We don't know. So that's what Bill Gates has to say. He, in fact, also started telling about how Elon Musk is doing a lot of things. But yeah, he said, and when we're talking about Elon Musk came into, or he appeared in Joe Rogan's recent podcast. And he had another vision, right? And that's again tied to the entire idea. So Elon Musk has been famous for the entire idea of, sustainable future and climate change, and how we need to have cars that are, electric vehicles, etc. He came up with this idea that I want something, I wish to see the Roadster, the Tesla Roadster, the hovering Roadster, so that it can fly technically. On the same front, there's a new advancement, which is the image that you can see just below there. So that half aircraft, half car is called the transition. Literally a transition from cars on road to cars that can fly. And it's recently got the approval from the FAA and the certification that says that, hey, this seems like a vehicle that can actually or is commercially viable. So who knows, maybe we'll actually start to see cars that fly. So yeah, a lot of, the big entrepreneurs working on the field of, climate change and creating a sustainable future. And the last thing that you see on the right there, that's another brand that is trying to redefine itself. And that's the Coca-Cola brand. So if you remember, it's written there, bottles made of paper. So another survey that recently came across is this survey called Break Free from Plastic. So this team called Break Free from Plastic, they conducted an annual survey and felt that they found out that Coca-Cola is in fact the chief plastic pollutant. So what Coca-Cola did is they rolled out this initiative called A World Without Waste, and this idea of creating a paper bottle. So this idea of paper bottle came in during this initiative. So this is not an entirely paper bottle. In fact, it's paper on the outside. It's lined by a little bit of plastic, but even that plastic is recycled plastic. And I think when I think of the idea of bottle, it reminds me of a glass. But now we're going to change the identity and we're going to redefine that. And so that ties, that guys is, the end of today's news. And as you all know, the connecting link, you might have guessed it, is identity, or redefining one's identity. As times change, we need to adapt. And if you're stuck on a particular identity, for example, I think a lot of you know that I'm a doctor, right? And as a doctor, if I let that be my only identity, I'm limiting myself to a lot of opportunities. And as the world changes, if I need to adapt, I might have to take in different roles. You need to be flexible. And that's the same thing that we see here. With cars that are flying, with meat that is from vegetables, with bottles, with social media platforms that are, or search engines going beyond that, with ministers that are taking up different roles based on times. Everyone's, with time, you need to start to not just get attached to your identity. Don't let your identity define you. That's about it, guys. I hope you liked today's news. If you did, please let us know in the comments. I really love a lot of the comments that you give. It makes me feel really special. Thank you once again. I hope you enjoyed today's news. Bye-bye.